y'all, it's Kay from the Literary Apothecary and welcome back to my channel. So last week I talked about 5 contemporary horror novels that are not Stephen King. Today I'm going to talk about 5 classic horror recommendations that aren't Stephen King. And just like last time, these are all books that I have read. Of course, there are many classics out there that are amazing and fit this category to a T, but I haven't read them yet, so I couldn't list them here. But let me know in the comments below what your favorite classic horror recommendations that aren't Stephen King are. Without further ado, we've got these broken up into a couple different categories because you know with horror and Halloween, you have your main categories that you see all the time. First up is vampires. So of course, when I think vampires, I immediately think Dracula by Bram Stoker. This was one of the very first classics that I read as a kid, and I was obsessed. Dracula was my first fictional crush, and I was just so obsessed with this book. As a teenager, I think I was like 13 when I first read this, and I have been obsessed ever since. I've watched every variation of the movie Dracula, and I have just been obsessed with Dracula ever since. Of course, Dracula is like the original vampire novel. It's written in epistolary format, so you get these journal entries from our main characters following this journey, and it's just so dramatic and just definitely a product of its time, and I just love it so much. This year, I am following along with Dracula Daily, which is a free subscription service, essentially, where the editor of this service has broken down the novel Dracula into each of the journal entry days. And every day when there's a journal entry in the novel, you get an email with just that journal entry in it. It's been so fun to follow Dracula in this way. My next classic horror recommendation that isn't Stephen King is another vampire classic. Of course, that's Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice. I read this book, I think it was last year, and I absolutely loved it. I fell in love with it from the first chapter. Again, kind of another epistolary format, although slightly different than Dracula, where this is told essentially in an interview format. We start off in the very beginning, getting to know what the interview is, and then the rest of the book, except for the very end, is kind of a flashback told during this interview with the vampire. And then I watched the AMC adaptation of this. Season 1 was last year. We're getting season 2, I think this year or early next year. Was so good, so much better than the original Brad Pitt Tom Cruise movie, which did not do it justice at all. But Interview with the Vampire is a great book if you want that spooky vampire feel with a antagonist, a villain who is just so complex and developed deeply and just so well done. I loved our villain in that book. Next up, we have the monster books, which is of course the original monster book, Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. If you've followed my channel for a while, you know how much I love Mary Shelley's writing. And it all started with Frankenstein, the 1818 version. I have yet to read the later version where she went back and kind of censored herself. But the 1818 version of Frankenstein blew my mind away. It was so much more than a horror book. It was so much more than a monster book. It took you to the depths of human suffering and just humankind. And I cried so much reading that book. And now, just thinking about it, I want to read it again right now. I gotta fit that in sometime soon because Mary Shelley just perfected this book so much. Next, in the realm of horror books and spooky Halloween stuff, of course, we have ghosts and haunting, and The first book that comes to my mind when I think of haunting is Beloved by Toni Morrison. In this book, you have Toni Morrison's amazingly beautiful writing telling this essentially haunting story of this Beloved is this child that was essentially not loved to the extent that she should have been loved. She was a product of slavery, and I can't talk a lot about it without giving away, because the true beauty of this book was in the revelations that came out about Beloved. If you want to be moved to sobbing tears in the most beautiful prose ever, with a haunting story that will haunt you forever, highly recommend Beloved by Toni Morrison. And then my last book on this recommendation list is actually not really a book in itself, but anything by Edgar Allan Poe, who was also one of my obsessions when I was a teenager. I was obsessed with Edgar Allan Poe. I loved everything that he wrote. I read everything. His poems, his short stories, his novellas, everything that had Edgar Allan Poe on it, I read it and I loved it. I devoured it. I wanted to be a combination of Edgar Allan Poe and Emily Dickinson. That was my dream as a teenager, but Edgar Allan Poe was definitely an obsession of mine, and something that stuck with me since I was in middle school. Now I've got 2 honorary mentions on this list. These are 2 short stories that I read way back in middle school. Again, I guess middle school was like my horror years, because all of these go back to middle school. These are 2 short stories that I had to read in class, and I was a weirdo and I loved everything that we had to read for class. I thought it was the best thing ever to be able to read for homework and not get in trouble for it. It was like the best thing in the world to me. So the 2 short stories that have stuck with me since then in the horror realm of literature include The Lottery by Shirley Jackson. This short story, holy cow, it gives me goosebumps just thinking about it. And we had to read this in middle school. Essentially, in this town, this fictional town, every year they had a lottery, and the winner of that lottery would get stoned to death by the rest of the townspeople. And the way that Shirley Jackson wrote this short story terrified me as a kid and haunted me for the rest of my life. I still remember that short story. I'm still talking about it today. That was just wow. And the other one that I'm going to recommend here is not quite as scary, but when I read it at the time, it was definitely scary. And that is The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving. This is, the Headless Horseman story, the original, where it started. And when I read this first, of course, before the Johnny Depp movie came out, and I was terrified. I thought it was so scary. And then several years later, I forget when the movie, 1999, so it was maybe a year or 2 later, the movie came out with Johnny Depp, and I think, I forget who else was in that. And it made it not so scary because it was Johnny Depp, and I loved Johnny Depp from the beginning. But it still kind of had that lingering horror feel to it. I feel like The Legend of Sleepy Hollow is actually a good short story. If you have more mature kids that want to get into horror reading, I feel like that short story is a good place to start, because it was super scary but not too scary. And I think it's a good place to start for kids. So those are my recommendations for classic horror books or short stories that aren't Stephen King. Let me know, of course, in the comments below what your recommendations are for classic horror books. What were your favorite horror books growing up as a kid, too? As always, my Patreon and my Discord information will be in the description below. Keep reading, and I love you all to the moon and back.